So over the last 12 months, we've seen the EU taxonomy, or take up and consideration of the EU taxonomy, really come to the fore, and SFDR as well since March, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. So I'll come to you first, Eimear. So you talk about green loan frameworks. Is SFDR on your radar? Is it important to you? So how do you progress? How do you align that with the work that you're doing with the funds?
Yes, sure. So SFDR is hugely important to us. So as you know, it sort of came into effect in March of this year. And so we spent a lot of time before that sort of assessing all of our funds in the market to see how we should report them in terms of SFDR and how we should market them essentially, because all funds in the market as of March needed to be classified in terms of SFDR, in terms of whether they're Article 6, Article 8 or Article 9. So Article 6 is that they take into account sustainability risk in the fund, Article 8 being that the fund promotes environmental or social criteria, and Article 9 being that the fund has a sustainable objective, so it's essentially an impact fund. So the majority of our funds, almost all of our funds in the market were Article 8, and that's because of the screening process that we have around both ESG and around climate. But from a real estate perspective, actually we found the regulation to be really helpful. It's helpful in that we don't think it's complete or it goes far enough. I think it could certainly do a lot more. But at least there are very prescriptive requirements in order to be considered sustainable from either real estate development or refurbishment. You have a taxonomy which actually tells you what those definitions are, and that's really the first time in our industry we've had a sort of a classification system like that. And that is really, we believe that's sort of groundbreaking. It could certainly do more. So if you look at the requirements, so for example, for sustainable real estate development, you need to be 10% above primary or below sort of improvement on primary energy demand for new buildings. Clearly in our green loan frameworks, we want our borrowers to do more, and so we require that. But at least it's a starting point. So that there is a clear ambition, and the taxonomy will evolve as well. So we've only got part of the taxonomy at the moment. We haven't. The rest of it's quite a lot of it's in draft, and obviously a social taxonomy will follow. But for the moment, we have climate change adaptation and climate change mitigation, and obviously with the built environment being such an enormous contributor to emissions, at least having those clear definitions is quite helpful. For refurbishment, it says if you have a 30% improvement in terms of primary energy demand versus pre-improvement, you're considered to be sustainable as well. But you also have to do no significant harm to any of the other environmental objectives of the taxonomy, and there's 5 other environmental objectives. So it's a useful benchmark for us, and so when we actually bring funds to the market, we can assess ourselves against it. But clearly we want to do more, and we want our ambition to be higher, and so that's what we've been doing. I think a key thing as well that from our perspective that's missing is it's very focused on operational energy. And it doesn't take into account whole life carbon, so it's entirely silent on embodied carbon. And so in the new framework we're developing, we're actually looking at what thresholds we should set for the borrowers in terms of embodied carbon for the UK residential market. And so we're looking at setting a high ambition and a medium ambition, and we're at the process now of, as I mentioned earlier, engaging with our sort of borrower community to see sort of where the ambition level should be and what's achievable.
So the take homes I got from that is the taxonomy is really helpful because it creates that definition system, but to put it bluntly, in some cases it doesn't go far enough.
Exactly.
So open to the panel in terms of considering your funds and positioning of your funds, and perhaps Peter and Nina keen to get your views first, and then Bill, I'll come to you. But have you considered Article 8 as effectively an entry level for your funds? Is that where you want to be, or have you got funds that are positioned at Article 6, which is for want of a better word, the bottom rung of the SFDR ladder? Nina.
So for our real estate funds that are caught by SFDR, all of them have been classified as 8 because we've kind of already got ESG targets at a fund level kind of predating the SFDR. So actually that was quite an easy kind of tick for us to do. Yeah. I think across M&G there's obviously been a huge focus on the funds that went in as 6 to reclassify them as 8, and I think that's just a general industry trend that we're seeing at the moment, that it isn't going to be very long that people want to be in that 6 bucket for. we don't have anything as 9 at the moment, and I think 9 is quite an interesting classification in terms of real estate and understanding it. There's obviously some funds that will sit in that, but I think one of the things that both the taxonomy and SFDR don't cope with very well at the moment is transition instruments. They weren't really designed for real assets where you buy something and you're going to improve it over a sort of period of years. A lot of the regulation is set that either it's sustainable now or it's not. And clearly we all know that it doesn't really work like that in the built environment. So I think transition is one of the areas where we definitely also think that there should be kind of improvement. Agree totally with you that I think it's providing a very useful kind of backstop. It's definitely starting the conversation. It's definitely driving investor interest. But we will also definitely see kind of improvements made to it over time as people get more familiar with using kind of what that means and applying the taxonomy and what tools do we do to do that and what else needs to kind of be added in the next layers of the taxonomy that will come.
Peter, where are you positioning your funds?
Yeah, it's very similar. I echo what Nina has said. For us, it's Article 8 because we jumped over that bar. It feels like some time ago already, but it's for us. What is important is that investors understand it is just a general baseline, so to speak. It doesn't allow you to really judge how strongly ESG orientated a fund is. And the one thing that I think is a bit of a shame is that gap to Article 9 is quite big. And if you want to have a genuine Article 9 impact fund, that is at the moment quite specific, we feel. There's room for something in between, something that takes on especially those transition dimensions as well. I think that would be helpful. But in general, just as a comment, going back to where we are here and what we touched on earlier, to me, I think this is the beginning of an era of much greater transparency and quantification of what it means to reach your ESG targets. And I think it was never going to be perfect. It's been done by the EU after all, but I think it's a very good start altogether with those different components, and I think it will inspire new generations of this regulation going forward. And also, if we're zooming out of Europe, just like we've seen with GDPR. There is this tendency that those regulations actually impact other geographies as well.
Yeah.
And that is something we're already seeing today, where we're going with European investors into other parts of the world, and they want exactly the same.
And they're carrying along the terminology and the processes. Yeah. Bill, I'm going to ask a slightly different question, because I suspect that the type of answer will be pretty similar to Peter's and Nina's. But my question to you is, from an investor perspective, do you see SFDR starting to create a very clear barrier to entry, or Article 6 not being acceptable going forward? So their standard funds not being acceptable, so the funds for the investors that you deal with have to have some form of commitment and have to be willing to show and communicate that?
Yeah, I think that's potentially part of how investors will interpret this. But I think the point I want to emphasise is that we've got the global economy transitioning to zero carbon. You've got assets in transition. Frankly, the regulatory regime is in transition too. So, the current SFDR regime is open to interpretation. I don't think that's totally nailed down, and there are issues that haven't been addressed. Embodied energy aspects, for example, and transition. But and I think for EVORA and all of us, the reality of this is that requirement for data measurement disclosure is going to be changing for quite a few years, with the bar getting increasingly higher.
Yeah.
And I think that's good. I'm not necessarily complaining. I think regulation is helping with that, but it's going to change, and that's going to be right. That'll be quite painful. There'll be heartburn. There'll be indigestion of all sorts, right? And I just think that's the world we're in. Makes our job harder for a while. I can imagine a time in the future where the regulation settles, if we really make progress, as we may do over the next 6, 8, 10 years, 15 years. It may be that the regulation settles, but it's going to be in transition for a while. And the reason I say that is it's quite hard for investors to really know what they're getting into with a Article 6, 8 or 9. And I don't think it's probably fair to say that everyone here will see 6, 8 or 9 in exactly the same way, because it's been there a short time, and I think interpretation is part of what's going on here. Whether or not the UK sustainable direct regulation is the same or a bit different, I'm not entirely sure, but we'll find out soon enough. So look, that's a note of realism. We need to expect the bar to get higher and higher. People may be snooty about 6 now, but I would say 8 is going to be very passé 3 years from now.